Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first edition of the Shuki Show. I'm your host, Shuki Aaron, and today we're going to be talking about Yiddish culture. And so I have brought in one of my closest Yiddish experts, my grandfather. And without further ado, Pops, as I call you, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Ray Maislin. I'm 88 years old. I was born in the Bronx in New York City into a neighborhood that was probably 90 plus percent Jewish. And we were of, everybody was at least bilingual. In our case, it was because my mother came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire where they spoke German. And my father, even though physically he was only about 60 to 80 miles away, was from Tsarist Russia, where they spoke Russian. So to communicate in the house and communicate with us when we were born, us being my two older brothers and myself, Yiddish was the language we spoke at home. And as we integrated into the community, since most people spoke at least two languages, we started to learn English, but we didn't really get proficient in it until we were in kindergarten and moved up the chain of the educational system.
That's interesting. Can you tell me about the influence Yiddish had on your neighborhood?
Yes, for example, we could be almost the equivalent of a shtetl in the shopping areas. The signs on the windows were in Yiddish and in English. We'd shop as if we were in Europe. If you wanted a chicken, you would go to the chicken shop, and the chickens would be running around live in their cages, and you would select the chicken, and the shopkeeper would take it out back and get it ready for you. Short wring its neck and take its feathers off, etc. If you wanted to eat fish, you went to the fishmonger, and the fish was swimming in the tanks, and you picked out the fish you wanted, and he would net it out for you, and he'd put it into a bag with water, and you would take it home, and if you weren't ready to eat it that night, you just put it in the bathtub and let it swim around. Uh, if you wanted to get baked goods, you went to the bakery. All these were separate shops, and you got your bread fresh every day. If it was day old, that really made it where it was not considered fresh, and it was actually sold as a discount in the bakery shops. And as you would walk down the streets, there would be people pushing push carts where they would be selling vegetables, or there would be grocery stores that also would sell vegetables as well as dairy products. And most of the transactions were handled in Yiddish. I still remember the young man who would call out and say, "Bye, bye, 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 bye." Women, 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 and he'd call out his wares. So you could have been in Poland or Russia or Lord knows where.
That's really fascinating. Now, I'd like to maybe go back to life at home and the influence of Yiddish in the house. Now, uh, from what I understand, Yiddish was really the language of your family, of your house. Uh, now, what activities would you do involving Yiddish besides, talking and I mean, would you use Yiddish radio as a form of entertainment or things of that nature?
Yes, there were several Yiddish radio stations, and Sunday morning was completely devoted to listening to the radio in Yiddish because most people were working in those days 6 days a week. So although there was some Yiddish program they had at night, Sunday was the main thing. In our household, the Sunday was devoted to listening to Yiddish programs. For example, there would be people like Molly Pecan, who was famous on the radio and later became famous in television in the early stages of television. For example, when we were getting ready for our bar mitzvah, we would go down the Lower East Side. And I remember the commercial for that was Joe and Paula Faganigin, Kot Asut Agabadim ranked the line that sign that climb the scene with Joe and Paul for happiness, for your mitzvahs. Bring your sons down and get your bar mitzvah suit. And we would do that. It was a ritual, as I said, with two older brothers. And downtown was the Lower East Side. And you would go from shop to shop, including Joe and Paul, to where you would get the best deal, and it would involve a lot of bargaining. And after it was all done, the reward was you would go to a kosher deli. And the delis in those days was as good as delis I've ever had in my life. And since our home was kosher, it was a given it had to be a kosher deli. So it was, and at that time, about 40% of the population of New York City was estimated to be Jewish, and I would strongly suspect probably at least half of them were in the same situation that we were in Bronx and in Brooklyn and in Lower Manhattan, which was the main areas where the Orthodox Jewish population, Eastern European population resided at that time.
Great. That's fascinating. Now, I know that you're a very humorful man, very funny guy, and I'm wondering if you think that the Yiddish language has an influence on comedy, especially with comedians like Sid Caesar and Mel Brooks and Lenny Bruce. Where do you see Yiddish being potentially fostering for a good sense of humor?
Well, I think it definitely was part of it. For example, we had a very hard life, so you had to have humor to make it bearable. And Yiddish humor, where you would take pathos, or whatever way you want to pronounce it, and make it funny, so you could live with it. And not only would that extend to daily life, if you were to go away on your summer vacation to the Catskill Mountains, which is where all these comedians would go, the Catskills, were all kosher hotels, and they were known for two things: their food and their comedians. And of course, the food was always very good because they weren't, you would go back to the same place. And the comedians all came out of that. The ones you mentioned, and many others, Myron Cohn, Milton Berle, etc. And they were the comedians that were in vogue at the beginning of television as well as radio. And it all came from the heritage of where you had to make light of everything in life. And this became a facet of it. And the Yiddish language. The Yiddish language itself was one that lent itself. For example, there were a lot of cuss words, but no curse words. And the cuss words, again, could be ingrained into the activities of a stage, and many people that came out of we had the Yiddish theater. We even had a Yiddish theater that was in the neighborhood, in which the plays were all in Yiddish. And you had people that came out of the Yiddish theater. One of them was a very famous actor named Paul Muni, who in the Yiddish theater was Muni Weisenfeld. And another one named Edward G. Robinson, as well as the comedians you mentioned. There was a great desire for escapism, and the Yiddish theater and comedy provided that escape.
Great. That's really interesting. Now, I wanted to get on to a story that you have told me before about when you became a Yiddish interpreter. Can you go into that story for the audience, please?
Yes. Back in the mid-1980s, the Jewish population of the Soviet Union wanted to emigrate, which was impossible because in the Soviet Union you had to be happy, and if you were happy, why would you want to emigrate? And the two places they wanted to go to was Israel or the United States, not necessarily in that order. So when you announced as a Soviet citizen you want to emigrate, the first thing that happened is you would lose your job. But everybody had to work because otherwise you'd go to jail. They had 100% employment, for whatever way they construed that. So these people would take a step down while they sweated out this process. We in the United States were pushing for pressure to be placed on the Soviet Union to let these people emigrate. They were called refuseniks, but in the meantime, they had to live, and they had to be provided with the idea that people who were really looking for them would help them. So we were one of the groups that went into the Soviet Union to help accomplish the objectives I described a moment ago. And the way we got in there, because they were really cracking down at that time, is that we were a group sent to the Soviet Union to study the transportation systems of Moscow and Leningrad, and now St. Petersburg. And as a cover, the mayor of the city of Houston came out with a proclamation, and we took two city councilmen with us. One was black, one was Polish, and in addition to that, we took a religious editor of the largest newspaper in the state of Texas, the Houston Chronicle, who also happened to be a Baptist minister. Well, as we were getting to go, knowing that the younger people spoke English, but the older people of my generation spoke Yiddish, we were equipped because there was an interpreter who had used Yiddish much more than I had in the almost 40 years that I lived in Houston. And at the last minute, she could not go because her father had a heart attack. And literally, they were on the driveway of their home with a cab driving up, and she got the telephone call. So I was appointed the Yiddish interpreter, again, as I said, after not having used the language for almost 40 years. And what would happen, we had lists of people that we were supposed to contact. And we bring goods into them, and such as medication that they needed, and also things that were could be bartered. For example, we loaded up with jeans and pantyhose and lipsticks of various items that women could use to make themselves more beautiful, and we had to contact these people, and which was somewhat made more difficult by the Russians, because we knew that not only were our rooms tapped, but our telephones were tapped. So we would go down to use some outside telephones, generally down near the subway station, and we had to have accurate information because there were no telephone books in the Soviet Union. They didn't want you to find anybody. And what we would do is we'd take 3 phones in a row, and our people would tie up 2 phones, one on each side, and the person making the telephone call would occupy the middle. And we would make our contact if they spoke English. One of the English-speaking people would take that part of the load, and if they only spoke Yiddish, it then became my task to get through to them. And there were some humorous situations, but mostly we did communicate. We did accomplish our mission. I'm happy to say that everyone we visited, when the walls finally did come down because of pressure from the United States and the Jackson, I think it was Jackson-Vanik Amendment dealing with trade with the Soviet Union, everyone we met with did get out, with the bulk of them going to State of Israel.
Very interesting. We've been having some technical difficulties. I seem to have lost the video feed from you. So I am going to find a way to fix that, and we will be back with another broadcast momentarily. Thank you. Okay. Now, what I'd like to ask you is, I know that you don't really speak much Yiddish anymore, and that's very, very common for people in your situation that grew up in the times that you grew up, and a lot of people have been forgetting the language of that nature, and some people are arguing that the language is dead or dying. And I'm just wondering what you have to say about that.
I would hate to see Yiddish die. Yiddish is what kept the Jewish people together because no matter what country they were in, as long as they could communicate in Yiddish, they were one community. I'm glad to see that Yiddish is coming back by being taught not only in schools, but in people that are going to places like Jewish community centers, etc., and are taking Yiddish classes. And I understand there are Yiddish classes at the University of Texas. I recall an author we had here at one of our book fairs, and he was from Poland, but living in Paris. And he would meet once a month with another gentleman who spoke Yiddish, so their Yiddish would not get rusty. The gentleman he met with was Bishop Levy, the Roman Catholic bishop of Paris, who had been born Jewish in Poland and still wanted to continue his knowledge of the Yiddish language. This disagrees with the way some Israelis feel because they feel that it was the language of the ghetto. But I remember that were it not for the ghettos, was as far as I was concerned, where I was born and raised in New York City also was a ghetto, and our ability to communicate, we wouldn't have been able to progress the ways that we have from the immigrations that came in shortly from the beginning about 1900 or so. I'm talking about the immigration from Eastern Europe, excuse me, and probably continued up through 1930, 1940, with refugees coming out in the 1950s. So I think the common thread of the Yiddish language, where you could communicate with other Jews, no matter where they came from in the world, was very important in the survival of Judaism and the continuation of Judaism. And I would hate to even think of it as becoming a dead language.
That's very interesting. I very much agree with you. And that brings me to my next question. What would you say to my generation regarding how we could preserve the Yiddish language and make sure it doesn't die out?
Well, I would say the only way that you could do it is, first of all, to learn Yiddish. And you may find as you travel around the world and you're in a foreign country and you may not speak French or Spanish or Russian, you might find someone who can communicate with you in Yiddish if you learn the language, plus the fact it's a very colorful language. And it's those aspects of it that led to the great comedians of the days of Sid Caesar, etc., was because of the Yiddish background to my mind. So not only do I like to see it here, I like to see it all over the world, so we can maintain the colorful part of our heritage that kept us alive from when the temples were destroyed and we became the wandering Jews with a common language.
Well, I think this has been a fascinating talk, and we've covered a good bit. And I'd like you to know that I hope to learn a little bit more about Yiddish and keep supporting it, and definitely will be thinking of it in all the best terms. I know that it's had a great influence on you, and by proxy, it means that it's had a great influence on me.
Josh, I would just like to add, as we're terminating this, Zeitgeschehen, social latency 120, which is be healthy, and you should live to 120 years of age in good health and sound mind. Now continue.
There we go. Well, thank you for talking with me, and it's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot about Yiddish culture this semester, and this is really just the culmination of everything, is being able to talk to you about it. And
I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
All right. All right. To all of us watching, and everybody else, thank you, and have a nice evening.
Thank you, and Zeit gesehen.